A hush fell over the crowd in the sleepy village of Brackenford as a figure in a fraying purple cloak stepped onto the makeshift stage in the town square. Torches flickered against the night sky, illuminating his broad grin and the battered lute he clutched in trembling hands. Word had spread quickly through Brackenford, as it did in every hamlet, town, or city he visited. The man called himself Marin the Melody Maker, and he was rumored to perform the strangest concerts anyone had ever heard. Well, perform might be too generous a word, but that was exactly what the people were looking forward to. Something new, something different. And by all accounts, Marin's act was definitely different. He stood still for a moment, letting the expectant murmurs wash over him. All of Brackenford seemed to have turned out. Farmers in dusty boots, bakers still wearing flour-dappled aprons, a blacksmith absent-mindedly rubbing a soot stain off his cheek. Everyone gazed up at the stage with anticipation. Marin bowed low, doffing a battered felt hat in respect. From this vantage, he could smell the sweet tang of fresh-baked bread from a nearby stand. Being a traveler meant he rarely got to enjoy simple pleasures for long, but he delighted in how each village had something special about it. Brackenford, for instance, was known for its honey oat loaves. Marin made a mental note to enjoy some after his show, if he could manage to stay. The man at the edge of the stage, presumably the mayor, gave Marin a polite nod and a half-smile of gentle encouragement. He was either very curious or bracing for chaos. Possibly both. Marin wondered if the mayor had any idea just how unconventional the performance would be. Marin had traveled extensively, gathering songs and notes from both famous bards and random wanderers, except he'd done something no one else had ever done. He distilled those findings into an entire repertoire of animal-influenced songs that were sure to baffle an audience. Over time, he had perfected his method, though perfected was another word that might be too strong. "Greetings, Brackenford," he called, after carefully clearing his throat. "I trust you are all ready for a night of musical wonder and majesty." He slowly tugged the lute's strap over his shoulder and took a step forward, letting the hush of the crowd fill him with heady excitement. He plucked one or two random strings, forcing a sharp strum to ripple through the air. Confused whispers skittered around the audience. Was there something off about this fellow? Sure, many traveling bards roamed the countryside, trading tales and tunes for coin and lodging, but Marin had a special style all his own. Without further ado, he said, "Allow me to begin." He strummed the lute and held it to his side. Then, taking a deep breath, he threw back his head and let out a melodic moo. There was a collective intake of breath from the gathering. No one applauded. No one even coughed. They simply stared. Marin, undeterred, continued. He pressed a hand theatrically to his chest and bellowed a more elaborate moo, warbling at the end as if scaling an imaginary chord progression. The second moo garnered a few scattered chuckles. Children in the front row tried to mimic him, giggling as they did. Marin allowed himself a small grin. But he pressed forward with the performance, launching into the next piece with unwavering determination. His lute rasped a few gentle chords, followed by a soft, trembling hush. The hush was quickly replaced by a series of high-pitched chirps. "Cheep, cheep, cheep," he squeaked, perched on the tip of his toes, arms outstretched like stubby wings. An old woman in the crowd raised an eyebrow so sharply it nearly disappeared under the brim of her bonnet. A blacksmith whispered, "Birds? He's clucking like a chicken, or maybe a sparrow, I can't tell." Another villager snorted softly and tried to stifle a laugh. Marin's entire existence played out in these reactions. He thrived on the shock, the puzzlement, the slight exasperation. And if he could coax a hearty belly laugh from just one person, he counted the performance a success. So on he went, squeaking and squawking, howling and meowing, letting his voice tumble through an array of farmyard, woodland, and even exotic creature calls, stopping every now and again to strum the lute in a haunting chord or two. Some notes were startlingly accurate, while others sounded like a goose in the midst of a very confusing day. But that was part of the fun. By the time Marin switched into a deep, resonate donkey bray spliced with a pig's snort, which he considered the grand finale, Brackenford was in an uproar. Perhaps half the crowd wore expressions of befuddlement, but the other half was roaring with laughter. Children clapped their hands against their knees, and the blacksmith unleashed a chuckle so booming it shook the wooden scaffolding of the stage. The stony-faced mayor even let slip a forced grin, and that, to Marin, was as good a sign as any that his night's work here was done. As the last trembling oink echoed around the square, Marin doffed his hat again, bowed, and collected his meager coins from a woven basket near the stage. He had come to accept that applause for him was mostly laughter, or in some towns faint booing, though those were rarer. The main reward, truly, was the confusion. He adored it. To him, bafflement was the purest form of engagement. People weren't lulled into a pleasant tune they'd heard a dozen times before. They were forced to pay attention, to question their assumptions about music, performance, and artistry. After packing up his loot, Marin stepped off stage. He was approached by no fewer than 6 wide-eyed children who wanted him to replicate that squeaking bird sound. Marin happily obliged, tipping his head and chirping softly, prompting squeals of delight. Then, with a grin, he turned to the mayor who had come forward. He pressed a few coins into Marin's hand and cleared his throat. I must confess, good sir," the mayor said, "that was inventive. I'm not fully sure I would call it music if pressed, but the people seem entertained. Where do you plan to go next?" Marion pocketed the coins and stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Wherever the wind calls me, my good man. Wherever I'm meant to share the wondrous tapestry of these shapes of sound." He said it with self-deprecating irony. He had learned early on that any attempt to justify or explain his show was more perplexing than the show itself. "I see," said the mayor, though he clearly didn't. "Well, safe travels. If you'll be staying in Brackenford overnight, I suggest the Wren's Rest Inn. Just perhaps keep the noise down for the patron's sake when you rehearse." Marin politely nodded and made his way across the square, weaving through a crowd that parted for him like he was an eccentric spirit. Pockets of acquaintances whispered among themselves, speculating whether the bard was in direct communion with forest creatures or practicing arcane comedic magic. To some, he was a sideshow attraction, but to Marin, each new rumor was part of the fun. Everyone would have a story to tell. "A man came through our village and sang like animals all night long." At the Wren's Rest Inn, Marin unbuckled the strap from his lute and laid it gently on the small bed. The innkeeper had frowned when Marin entered, probably expecting the typical evening serenade for tips from a traveling bard. But Marin had promised no concerts within these walls, lest he scare off the other guests. After all, even he recognized that midnight donkey braying might not lead to restful slumber for weary travelers. Still, as soon as he closed his door, he couldn't help humming in an odd rhythmic pattern, something between a thrush's warble and a cat's purr. Then, exhausted from the day, he snuffed the candle and let sleep wash over him. He set out early in the morning, traveling light, with just his lute, a small pack, and his ridiculous sense of adventure. The road to his next stop, an inland city called Greyhaven, was long and dotted with farmland. Marin amused himself by greeting crows that perched on creaking fences and trotting past curious goats who bleated at him in the distance. On more than one occasion, a piece of his meager brunch bread, cheese, or fruit found its way into the outstretched beak of a nearby goose. For all his comedic flair, Marin genuinely loved animals. He felt a kinship with them, even if they couldn't quite appreciate his arguably clumsy attempts to imitate them. Halfway to Greyhaven, Marin came across a cottage scene straight out of a pastoral painting. A young shepherdess with a flock of sheep scattered on a hillside, the sunshine filtering through leaves. He paused to watch the sheep, their soft bleating echoing across the grass. The shepherdess, a girl in a patched gingham dress, waved at him timidly. He returned the gesture, and without thinking, he let out a gently modulated bleat, followed by a second one in a higher pitch. Instantly, the sheep's heads popped up in unison, ears angled in confusion. To Marin's delight, some of the sheep actually responded. The shepherdess giggled, and he couldn't help but walk closer. "Hello," he said. "Your flock is lovely, and apparently well-versed in response to comedic calls." The shepherdess blushed. "They're easy to amuse if you provide them something curious. Never seen a bard do that, though." Marin grinned. I aim to amuse. May I? He gestured to his lute. The girl's eyes lit up. He took a seat on a smooth rock, strummed lightly, and launched into a playful synergy of lute chords entwined with soft, lilting sheep bleats. It wasn't his full performance by any means. It was an intimate moment, more of a personal joke. He watched as the shepherdess's eyes filled with wonder, and the sheep, confused but not displeased, wandered closer to investigate. When Marin finished, the shepherdess clapped enthusiastically, both for the novelty and genuine enjoyment. That was the funniest, strangest thing I've ever heard, she said. Are you on your way to Greyhaven? I am indeed, Marin replied, rising from the rock and tucking his lute away. Perhaps if you ever journey there, you can stop by the city square and listen in. With a tip of his hat, he trudged onward, leaving the shepherdess and her flock behind to their pleasant hillside grace. Greyhaven, though not the largest city in the region, was significantly bigger than Brackenford or any of the small villages Marin had visited. Tall spires of stone loomed over bustling market streets, and pennants fluttered in the thick coastal breeze. If Brackenford had been a gentle introduction to his brand of animal music, Greyhaven would be a challenge. With more people came potentially harsher critics, but also the promise of richer rewards, should they appreciate his show. Marin entered through the grand gate, weaving between carts laden with fish, barrels of produce, and clanging blacksmith shops echoing with the ring of hammers. He found a small tavern advertising an open mic night, though typically that would mean a lyricist or a poet. The tavern's name was the Gilded Swan, and the golden sign above the entrance made Marin smile. A swan was a perfect bird for him to mimic, and he wondered if that might hint at a warm reception. Inside, the atmosphere bristled with lively conversation, men and women huddled over wooden tables, sipping mead and ale. A modest stage stood in the corner. Upon seeing Marin's lute, the tavern keeper, a robust woman with red braids, beckoned him over. You're a bard, are you? She said loudly, wiping a mug with a rag. We could always use more entertainment, especially early in the evening before the regular crowd gets too rowdy. Fancy playing a few tunes? Marin returned the smile. Certainly. I only ask that you let me finish, no matter how unusual it might be. She gave him an odd look. I've heard all sorts. Give it your best shot. I only pay if you get a decent reaction, though. Agreed? Agreed, he said, ignoring the subtle flicker of doubt in her eyes. He found a small seat near the corner and waited for his turn. When the moment came, Marin mounted the stage in front of a few curious onlookers. Most of the crowd was busy chatting, and it would take something unique to capture their attention. That was precisely what Marin could offer. He started with a donkey bray, loud, sharp, and slightly off-key. A hush fell, and a handful of bargoers burst into laughter. One of them sloshed ale all over his table. Marin grinned triumphantly. He progressed from donkey brays to pig snorts, from crow caws to cat meows. Every so often, he'd add a dramatic strum on the lute, just enough to keep a faint melody behind the cacophony. It was unorthodox, undeniably comedic. People were turning in their seats, jaws hanging in disbelief. Not a single person walked away. In fact, one tall, heavily armored knight near the back seemed to be choking on his drink from the force of his laughter. Then Marin pulled out a flourish that was brand new, an attempt at a peacock's cry, shrill and boastful. He'd studied it from a traveling caravan a few months back, memorizing the sharp wail. When he unleashed it, the entire tavern seemed to vibrate with startled delight. Applause and giggles erupted from all corners of the room. It was so ridiculous that it transcended any notion of conventional taste. Even the tavern keeper, crossing her arms at the edge of the bar, wore a grin that battled to break free from her stern expression. For the finale, Marin chose a hodgepodge of barnyard calls, layered one over the other, accompanied by dramatic lute strums. It was less a melody and more a comedic demonstration of how bizarre the human voice could be when repurposed. The tavern exploded in applause at the end. Actual applause, not just laughter. Marin took a deep bow, relishing the moment. This was the sort of reception he lived for. Afterward, patrons swarmed him, some trying to replicate his calls, others shaking their heads in amazement, and a few offering to buy him a drink. The tavern keeper clapped him on the shoulder. All right, I'll admit it, that was the strangest performance we've ever hosted, but you kept them entertained. She pressed a small coin purse into his hand. Here's your pay. Stick around or come back tomorrow night if you can muster another set. Thank you, Marin said, pocketing the purse. Usually he never stayed in one place for more than a couple of nights, fearful that his act would turn stale and the novelty might wear off. But Grey Haven was lively and the audience was still abuzz with curiosity. He resolved to stay for at least a few days. The next day dawned bright and Marin found himself exploring Grey Haven's main market, listening to the hawkers cry out prices for fresh fish, produce, and craft goods. He came upon a booth where a woman sold small wooden carvings of various animals, a perfect souvenir for a self-proclaimed animal singer. He picked up a wooden lamb figurine and studied it with a half smile. A voice behind him asked, "Something catch your fancy, friend?" Marin turned to see a young woman dressed in a practical tunic, presumably the carver's apprentice. She gave him a warm smile. He nodded. "Yes, indeed. I like how these bring out the essence of the animal. This lamb, for instance, has wonderfully expressive eyes." She grinned. "I try to carve them as lifelike as possible. Folks from around here love the bird carvings especially." She held out a small wooden swallow, wings poised as if mid-flight. Marin's eyes lit up. "I travel, performing," he explained. "Animal calls and songs, if you can believe that." She laughed. "I've actually heard chatter about you surging through the market these last few hours, people calling you the man who sings like a barnyard come to life. I had to see if I'd run into you. I guess I got lucky." "It's my odd little talent," he said with a wink. "How about a trade? One of your carvings in exchange for a personal demonstration?" "Deal," she said, clapping eagerly. She handed him the wooden swallow. Marin gently slipped it into his pack. Then, mindful of curious onlookers passing by, he launched into a short medley of bird calls. Chirps, coos, trills. It wasn't quite the thunderous display he used for big crowds, but it was enough to draw a small gathering. Mothers with children paused to watch, giggling behind their palms. One old man, missing more than a few teeth, stopped in mid-step, grinned, and gave Marin a thumbs up. When he finished, the woman who'd carved the figurine gave him a hearty round of applause, her eyes gleaming. "You have a gift," she whispered, as if worried about scaring it away. "A bizarre, charming gift." He accepted the compliment graciously, then left the booth, making his way through the throng of shoppers. Above all, he delighted in how kind-hearted these people were. In some cities, he'd been chased away or booed off stage for disrespecting the art of music, but Grey Haven felt open-minded and playful. That night, Marin returned to the Gilded Swan to do another set. Word had spread and the tavern was packed. He was greeted with cheers the moment he stepped onto the stage, and he repaid the crowd's enthusiasm with gusto. Marin soared through an expanded repertoire. A swan's honk, a goat's bleat, the gentle hoot of an owl, weaving them into a comedic tapestry of sound. Strangely, in the midst of all the laughs and applause, Marin felt a sense of actual musical connection forming. Sure, it was silly, sure it was more comedic than melodic, but there was something undeniably human about the way the audience connected with these primal calls. They recognized them from daily life, from nature, from the lullabies of farmland nights, and in that recognition found a childlike joy that was sometimes missing in more formal performances. Toward the end of his set, in a fit of inspired bravado, Marin tried melding a donkey bray and a wolf howl in quick succession. It almost worked. Almost, until he lost his pitch and ended on a strangled note that sounded suspiciously like a crow with a sore throat. The audience cracked up, and Marin chuckled along with them, feeling no need to hide the mistake. Flaws and slip-ups were part of the performance, proof that it was authentic and delightfully chaotic. After the show, a local merchant approached him. She introduced herself as Gilana, a coordinator for Grey Haven's seasonal festivals. "We've got a Harvest Moon festival starting in a few weeks," she told him. "It's a pretty big event, merchants, performers, parades. The mayor's office always pays for unique acts." Marin raised an eyebrow. "Unique is definitely what I do." Gilana smiled. "You're exactly what we're looking for. If you're still in town in a few weeks, we'd love to have you perform on a proper stage, maybe lead a comedic segment. It pays well." Sparks of interest lit Marin's eyes, but a faint pang of worry tugged at his mind. He rarely stayed anywhere that long for fear of wearing out his novelty. But the notion of having a real stage and an official place in a respected festival was tempting, and the pay, well, streams of coins never hurt a traveling bard. "Let me think about it," he said politely. Jelana nodded. "Sure, the festival's in 3 weeks. You could let me know any time before that, and you know where to find me, City Hall or around the markets." When Marin retired to his small inn room that night, he sat on the edge of the bed, thinking hard. Could he remain in Greyhaven for that long? Would people still be amused by a donkey and crow duet after a few more nights of hearing it around town? Then again, performing in a festival on a grand stage might mark a turning point. Instead of just being a wandering curiosity, he'd be part of something bigger. Maybe, if his performance proved popular, he could open the door to more widespread acceptance. Or at the very least, he'd walk away with enough gold to travel comfortably for a while afterward. Ultimately, he decided to stay, he informed Galana the next morning, practicing a new variant of his vocal routine every day to keep his act fresh. As the days went by, Marin roamed Greyhaven's outskirts, gathering inspiration from the wildlife. He spotted foxes near the wooded edge, practiced their yips. He heard seagulls along the harbor, perfect for a new, jarring squawk. He discovered the city's stray cats were legion and tried mixing a variety of meows using the lute's strings for comedic effect. By the time the festival drew near, Marin had an entire suite of new calls, more elaborate than anything he had done in the past. He was ready. On the evening of the Harvest Moon Festival, Greyhaven's Central Square was awash in lantern light and bustling crowds. Merchants from distant lands hawked exotic wares, jugglers tossed brightly lit torches into the air, and children ran about carrying sticky sweetmeats. A grand stage draped in crimson cloth had been erected near City Hall, and every seat was filled, with townsfolk spilling out on either side to watch the show. Minstrels strummed lively tunes, acrobats tumbled across the stage, and the crowd roared with approval. At last, Gilana strode onto the stage and introduced Marin, describing him as the traveling bard who will dazzle you with cries from all across the animal kingdom. There was a ripple of curiosity followed by immediate applause from those who had already heard him at the Gilded Swan. Stepping onto the stage, Marin felt a novel shiver of anticipation. He took a deep breath. He began softly, teasing the air with the gentle bleat of a lamb and layering it with a minor chord progression on the lute, an almost eerie pastoral lullaby. Then, one by one, he introduced new calls. The honking of geese in flight, the squeaking chatter of a field mouse, the shriek of a hawk overhead. Applause grew with every shift in sound. Next came the donkey brays, the pig snorts, the proud peacock wail that had become a crowd favorite. Marin took them on a comedic journey through farmland, forest, and jungle, ensuring each call was a seamless shift well, almost seamless. There was a comedic dissonance in the abrupt transitions, but that only added to the performance's charm. He peppered in the Bray Wolf howl combo, corrected the crow sore throat fiasco, and introduced the brand new gull screech for a surprising punch. The audience howled with delight, or at least a portion of them did. Others just stared, open-mouthed, in baffled fascination. Marin couldn't have asked for more. His finale was an energetic swirl of nonsense. Donkey bray to pig snort to crow caw to goat bleat, culminating in a triumphant peacock screech that resonated off the city walls. The effect was so spectacularly bizarre and hilarious that the entire crowd erupted in wild applause and whistles. Children jumped up and down as parents laughed and clapped. Merchants cheered, as did the more refined watchers in their high-backed chairs. Marin, chest heaving with exertion and sweat on his brow, bowed deeply, letting the thunderous reaction wash over him. When the applause finally subsided, Marin stepped down to find Jelana waiting with open arms. She pressed a heavy pouch of coins into his hand and beamed. "That was magnificent," she said. "Some are still confused, but everyone was entertained. You've really given us something memorable." Nearby, the mayor of Greyhaven, an older man sporting a decorative chain of office, gave Marin a hearty pat on the back and declared, "Absolutely the strangest, funniest show I've seen in all my years. Bravo." Exhausted but elated, Marin accepted their praise with a grateful smile. He lingered at the festival for a while, sampling roast apples and hot cider, chatting with townsfolk who wanted to know how on earth he discovered his bizarre talent. He offered half answers, weaving comedic tales of being raised by crows or learning from donkey gurus, none of which were the actual origin of his skill. Truthfully, he never had a grand origin story. He just loved animals and had a knack for mimicry. Over time, it evolved into this comedic art form. That night, Marin gazed up at the luminous harvest moon from a quiet spot behind the festival tents. He could still hear music and laughter drifting on the breeze. For a moment, he considered staying in Greyhaven indefinitely. He'd found acceptance, even adoration. The easy path would be to remain, to become a city fixture and earn a comfortable living. But deep down, Marin knew his spirit belonged to the road. He wasn't ready to give up the adventure and unpredictability of traveling from town to town, delighting unsuspecting villagers with his comedic menagerie of sound. So he resolved that come dawn, he'd press onward, his lute slung over his shoulder and his coin purse rattling with new possibilities. So long as there were astonished faces and hearty laughs to kindle, he'd keep singing animal songs across the land, and perhaps one day, in some far-flung city or a quaint country festival, he might just stumble on an even more peculiar form of expression. Because in a world that thrived on novelty, it took a certain courage and a healthy sense of humor to stand on a stage and fill the air with the voices of the creatures that roamed fields and forests. As Marin nestled against a crate, humming gently to himself in that half-bird, half-human style, he couldn't help but feel the night had been a resounding success. With the harvest moon overhead guiding him, he let out a soft, triumphant hoot, an owl's gentle sigh, and smiled. Tomorrow the road called again, and he would answer, voice brimming with the chorus of every beast he'd ever encountered. And he was sure that wherever he went, people would be baffled, entertained, and reminded that music, no matter how strange, had a way of bringing them all together, if only for a night.